American imperialism. So in this lecture, we're going to be tracing the development of American capitalism from the industrializing era into an era of imperialism. And so we'll talk about what imperialism means. And essentially, it's the way in which America is using its military and its industries to project this image of American nationality abroad. So this is a period of time when the United States took its place among the various imperial powers in the world, centrally located in Europe at this time. So in world history, the last quarter of the 19th century is known as the age of imperialism, when European empires carved up large parts of the world for themselves. And by 1890, America is taking its place among these major European powers. So in this lecture, we'll be talking about what ideas and interests motivated the United States in creating this empire in the late 19th century. Okay, so in a broad overview, we'll be talking about this populist change in American politics with the election of William McKinley and the way in which William McKinley's foreign policy shaped American imperialism through the last decade of the 19th century. Then we'll also be talking about the domestic impacts of American imperialism, particularly regarding the narrowing definition of citizenship in the wake of Supreme Court cases like Plessy versus Ferguson and United States versus Wong Kim Ark. And then finally, we'll trace the development of imperialism as it expands through the Spanish-American War. So to talk about imperialism generally, imperialism is a form of advanced capitalism where industries are expanding their reach internationally. So imperialism boosts the well-being of capitalist societies and enables them to fend off, at least temporarily, the destructive consequences of their own internal contradictions. Capitalistic countries assert their dominance abroad. That's the primary objective here, is the way in which industries are asserting dominance abroad in foreign countries. And they do this for three reasons. So they do it for cheap labor, finding cheaper labor abroad, which contributes to increased profits and the growth of the middle class in the host country. So number one, cheap labor can be found abroad. Two, the harmful consequences of this capitalistic empire are hidden from the consumers. Okay, so the people that are consuming the products produced by these imperialistic corporations cannot readily see the negative consequences of their industries. Okay, we can think examples of, for example, Apple sweatshops in China. American consumers in the middle class can't see the ill consequences of the products in which they're buying right off the bat, because those warehouses are primarily located in Asia, right? So those are the two primary issues here. But the third issue is to increase national dominance through these corporations, through the spread of the corporations, because we're going to see over time, as we trace the Spanish-American War, that as American industries are expanding abroad, the military follows with them to protect those industries and to protect American trade interests. And in doing so, establishes strategic military bases throughout the world based on that growing imperial hold around the world. Okay. So the justification for the expansion of imperial power was that it would bring modern civilization to supposedly backward people. That's the reason why we're going to these various different locations to, quote-unquote, develop industry and enhance the lives of the people there. The natives, according to their colonial occupiers, would be instructed in Western values, labor practices, and the Christian religion. So right there we have a confluence between three major forces: military, religion, and capitalist profit. So eventually, these colonies, as they would come to be known, would be according the right of self-government, although no one could be sure how long this would take. In the meantime, empire was another word for exploitation. So as we see throughout the end of the 19th century, we see America's hold on its colonies and the development of its colonies increase, right? But the fact remains that by 1900, European nations had already colonized most of the southern hemisphere of the world. Okay, so in this diagram, we see it's a political cartoon. We're going to be studying numerous political cartoons through the first half of the semester. In this political cartoon, it traces the maturation of Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam being the representation of American democracy from this infant in the wake of the American Revolution to an adolescent growing into an older man with the cane, and progressively we see Uncle Sam growing fatter, right? Growing fatter, which corresponds to the increased profits and size of the United States economy over time. So that by the time you get to 1899, you see Uncle Sam quite engorged, holding a ship, which is to represent the international connections between American democracy and American capitalism throughout the world. And by 1899, you see all of these European powers that had colonized the rest of the world reaching out their hand to take part in some of the affluence that America was enjoying at that time. So this kind of represents the development of American capitalism in corresponding to the development of American democracy at this time, or institutions supporting American democracy or mitigating American democracy, depending on how you look at it. So in order to begin this discussion, we need to talk about the election of 1896, which has devastating consequences for American foreign policy in the way in which imperialistic powers are reinforced and motives are reinforced by the McKinley administration. So the election of 1896 is sometimes called the first modern presidency. So from the beginning, we can see the imperialistic motives imbued in this election, primarily because of the amount of money spent in this election. So Eastern bankers and industrialists poured millions of dollars into the Republican coffers, and this was the most expensive election to that date in American history. McKinley's campaign raised some $10 million compared to William Jennings Bryan's campaign only generated about $300,000. The results of the election revealed a stark divide in the nation along regional lines that were as stark as those divisions in 1860. Bryan carried the South and West and received 6.5 million votes, while McKinley swept the more populous industrial states of the Northeast and the Midwest, attracting 7.1 million votes. So it's not the biggest landslide in American politics, but nonetheless is representative of its era. The era's bitter labor strife did not carry over into electoral politics. Indeed, the party politics seemed to mute class conflict rather than reinforce it. Industrial America, from financiers, managers to workers, now voted solidly Republican, and so William McKinley wins this presidential election, and he's carrying on the interests of in industrial America, which we'll see play out overseas in terms of the imperialistic policies that he and Roosevelt begin to put in place. So, by all intents and purposes, we could see that American imperialism really begins to take shape in the aftermath of the election of 1896. And there are three key aspects to American imperialism. We'll get to Hawaii in a second. They are free market interests, number one, a specific kind of foreign policy called open door foreign policy, number two, and then three, religious incentives for colonization. So right from the bat, McKinley and Roosevelt implement this open door foreign policy, which corresponds to the idea that policy is based on the free movement of goods, money, but not people. Okay, so this is a foreign policy that is really erected to support America's growing international corporations, but at the same time, it's reflective of its xenophobic tendencies in restricting the immigration that we'll see in the destructive qualities of imperialism by the end of the semester, by the end of this lecture. So we have the open door policy, which again is which supports the free movement of goods, the free movement of money, but not the free movement of people. It bars immigration, right? Also, this foreign policy corresponds to the free market interests of corporations like John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil, like Singer Sewing Factory, in international markets, and particularly 5 international markets in particular: Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. And we'll be going through those systematically throughout this lecture. So in each of these regions of the world, there are cheaper markets, cheaper labor, which enables higher profits for these American corporations. Puerto Rico and Cuba were gateways to Latin America, and also strategic military outposts from which American naval and commercial power could be projected throughout the hemisphere. So we know that Puerto Rico and Cuba are very, very important, and that's why Cuba and Puerto Rico remain important territories or potential territories for the United States today. The Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii lay astride shipping routes in the markets to Japan and China. So similar to Puerto Rico and Cuba, Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii were also important commercial and military strategic points for American capitalism. Okay. By 1899, American foreign policy related to these territories that corresponded to the hemispheres of influence within these regions of the world. So the open door foreign policy referred to the free movement of goods, money, but not people from these areas. Okay? Even as the United States banned immigration to the Chinese in this country, insisted on the access to the markets and investment opportunities. So we've covered the free market imperatives, the foreign policy imperatives, the open door foreign policy, but there's also the religious imperatives as well. In addition to the military and commercial industries expanding their reach internationally, there's also a number of United States missionaries, religious Christian missionaries, emanating throughout the world, emanating from the United States around the world. Missionary work offered employment to those with few opportunities at home, including blacks and women who made up the majority of the total missionaries. So, in addition to these military and commercial interests, America was also projecting religious colonization throughout the world as well. So, Hawaii is the first of the 4 case studies that we'll be covering. But there for sure are more. So in 1893, Hawaii had its own independent monarchy. It was a monarchy independent of any European influence by this time, except influence of the United States. So America had strong trade and military relationships with this independent monarchy. There were vast numbers of farmers and American-owned plantations in Hawaii for the exact same reasons that we'll see again in the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, and that is primarily for cheap labor, cheap products, cheap labor, cheap land, and exponential increase in profits. So, although independent, Hawaii was already closely tied to the United States, as we've already established. The United States established trade treaties to protect imports of sugar from the American-owned plantations in Hawaii, and also Hawaii allowed the United States to establish a very robust naval base at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii's economy was dominated more or less by American-owned sugar plantations that employed a workforce of native islanders and Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino laborers working under long-term contracts. As early as 1893, a group of American planters organized a rebellion to overthrow the Hawaiian government in order to increase the benefits that they were receiving from the Hawaiian government. So in 1893, there's a rebellion that takes place fomented by American planters, sugar plantation owners in Hawaii. Okay, so you have a group of independent activists attempting to overthrow a independent monarchy. Okay, so Hawaii does rebut this revolution of planters. However, immediately the United States sends in the military to protect those planters. Okay, the military essentially takes over the independent Hawaiian government and establishes a military rule for at least 5 years. By July 1898, the United States annexes the Hawaiian Islands and occupies this territory as a kind of colony through which it's going to support its trade relations and its corporations and the sugar plantations in Hawaii. Now, it's important to know that the specific military unit that's deployed in the conquering, if you will, of Hawaii are black buffalo soldiers, the same buffalo soldiers that we saw on the western frontier that are used by white officers to expel Native Americans from territory that was deemed beneficial for American corporations. So in this instance, and in other instances, the buffalo soldiers, again, an all-black contingent, is used by the U.S. military to pursue imperialistic interests, which is a kind of interesting wrinkle in this broader story. The Spanish-American War, it begins in 1898 on the coattails of the annexation of Hawaii, and it really follows along in those same lines. So the origins of the Spanish-American War lay in a long war for Cuban independence. So up until this time, Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean had been Spanish colonies, colonies of the Spanish Empire. But in 1898, the Cuban people wage a war of independence against the Spanish Empire. And during this war for Cuban independence, a naval ship, a U.S. naval ship docked outside of Havana, was destroyed under strange and mysterious circumstances. It wasn't known whether or not the Spanish Empire had attacked the U.S. naval vessel preemptively, or if there was an act of sabotage committed by the Cuban revolutionaries themselves. Nonetheless, demands for intervention escalated after that explosion. So this explosion of the USS Maine was probably accidental, but later investigations included that the destruction of the battleship was actually a product of self-sabotage and used as a trigger for America to enter the war. American press blamed Spanish for the attack and insisted on retribution. So by 1898, President McKinley in April asked Congress for a declaration of war with the explicit purpose of, quote, aiding the Cuban patriots in their struggle for liberty and freedom. So after 1898, America again commits troops for the subjugation of this colonial territory. Okay, and again we see the Buffalo Soldiers deployed to subjugate this territory as well. Another unit that's deployed is a unit of independent mercenaries organized by Theodore Roosevelt, who was by then the Secretary of Navy. So Roosevelt envisioned his unit of mercenaries as a cross-section of American society, and so he enrolled athletes from the Ivy League colleges that he was familiar with. He also employed Western cowboys who were famous at that time. With the Army still segregated according to Jim Crow policies, he excluded blacks from his regiment. So there's no black people from his regiment. Black people are fighting independently with the Buffalo Soldiers. So the rallying cry for the Rough Riders in this time was a depiction of them charging in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Ironically, at this time, when the Rough Riders reached the top of San Juan Hill, he realized that the Buffalo Soldiers had already beat them to conquering that battle, to winning that battle. And this is a fact that Roosevelt omitted from his reports in the battle, which were widely reported in the popular press and by news sources. Overall, Roosevelt's exploits with the Rough Riders in Cuba made Roosevelt a national hero, and he was elected to governor of New York that fall, and in 1900 became McKinley's vice president in the second election of McKinley. And we can see in Roosevelt's presidency, after McKinley is assassinated, no spoilers, that a lot of this imperialistic policies are re-implemented and re-emphasized under Roosevelt. Similar to the situation of Cuba, the Philippines were also a Spanish colony up until this point, up until 1898. And like the Cubans, the Filipino people waged a war of independence against the Spanish Empire. Many Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans had welcomed American intervention as a way of breaking Spain's long hold of these Spanish colonial territory. Immediately, the Philippines appealed to Americans to aid in their revolution of the Spanish government. However, as soon as America starts to intervene, we see the priorities of the American government change subtly. In 1899, the Filipino movement turned against the United States. Mark Twain was famously observed, "We do not intend to free the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer them." And so this illustrates this imperialistic imperative where America goes into these wars of independence on the side of the revolutionaries, but ends up the oppressor of those same revolutionaries. The McKinley administration justified its policies on the grounds that its aims was to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, although most residents of the islands were already Roman Catholic. William Howard Taft, who became Governor General of the Philippines in 1901, believed it might a century to raise Filipinos to the condition where they could appreciate what Anglo-Saxon liberty is. And so William Howard Taft, who later serves as vice president under Roosevelt and wins election to presidency himself, serves as a kind of military governor, not unlike those military governors that we've seen in the Reconstruction South. In the 20th century, the territories acquired in this last decade of the 19th century would follow different paths. Okay, Hawaii, which had a stable population of American missionaries, planters, became a traditional territory. Its population, except for Asian immigrants, became American citizens, and it was admitted as a state in 1959. Nearly a half a century later of American rule, the Philippines achieved independence in 1946. Until 1950, the United States Navy administered Guam, which remains today an unincorporated territory of the United States. As for Puerto Rico, it is sometimes called the world's oldest colony because ever since the Spanish conquered the island in 1493, it has lacked full self-government. Today, the United States Congress extends American citizenship to Puerto Rico since 1917, but still does not grant Puerto Rican people the same extent of citizenship that white Americans have in continental United States. So, whatever the end result, the Spanish-American War established a precedent for American intervention that we're going to see replicated over time throughout the 20th century in conflicts like the Korean War, like the Vietnam War, like the Gulf War, and like the wars in the Middle East during the 1970s and 1980s. In the 20th century, the United States would intervene in Latin America to change local government, either by direct military action or via support for military coups, no fewer than 40 times. I want to turn now to representation of what European or a representation of what American colonialism looks like. Fordlandia is a production facility in Brazil, owned and operated, or at least it was, by the Ford Motor Company. And I think that Fordlandia really represents the corporate interests of imperialism during this time, in the way in which Ford is going down to Brazil primarily to seek cheaper labor, cheaper materials to increase his profits at the cost of the native laborers under his watch. So up until this time, it's important to know that the British Empire had a monopoly on the rubber trade, and by the 1920s. Rubber had become an important commodity primarily because of its utility in the construction of automobiles. So officially, Ford's interests in Brazil was as a business venture. The monopoly on Sri Lankan rubber oil maintained by the British was driving up costs of his new Model A cars. So he wanted to find a cheap source of latex that would allow the Ford Motor Company to produce its own tires and to cut the costs, reflecting some of Andrew Carnegie's own principles during this time. But Ford's vision of Fordlandia grew much deeper than that. Okay, so his goal was not simply to ship latex back to the Dearborn headquarters. It was to build his vision of an ideal society based on capitalistic principles, centered on a manufacturing industry. A city that would fuse the same concepts that Ford had championed throughout his career and bring together a brighter future for the forgotten part of the planet, and to likewise, quote unquote, civilize these native inhabitants of Brazil. So Brasilia was designed from the outset as a city that would bear Ford's name, a kind of utopia, a work of civilization in the Amazon. He believed the values that had made his company a success would build character for the Brazilian people and other places on the planet. So Fordlandia was just like the litmus test for this broader idea of an international Ford Motor Company empire. In 1928, he went as far as to announce, "We are not going to South America to make money. Rather, we're going to help and develop a wonderful and fertile land." So Fordlandia would become a city with modern features such as hospitals, schools, generators, electricity, sawmills. But by the end of the 1930s, its landmark structure was complete, a water tower that became a utilitarian beacon for the modern Ford's civilizing project. As Ford Motor Company's manufacturing operations became increasingly involved in the Second World War effort by the early 1940s, his holding in Brazil filled with American military personnel. Again, we see the confluence between private industry and American military in the example of Fordlandia. So by the end of World War II, Fordlandia started to decline, primarily because of the loss of military contracts at the end of World War II. By that time, by the time the war ended, Henry Ford was in quite poor health. So the management of the corporation fell to his eldest grandson, Henry Ford II, who promptly cut the company's ballooning costs by selling underperforming assets, including Fordlandia, leaving the inhabitants of Fordlandia, who had depended on the facilities and services that Ford had created, quite vulnerable, leaving them out to dry. So Ford II sold the property back to Brazil for a fraction of what his grandfather originally paid. So the Brazilian people were left exploited and left to fend for themselves. So now we're going to transition to the domestic impact of imperialism. So during this time, we see an efflorescence of nationalism and jingoism that is supporting imperialistic powers and the imperialistic development of American capitalism. So at this time, we see implemented traditions such as the Pledge of the Allegiance, recited at the beginning of classrooms, or even at baseball games and other recreational activities. The Star-Spangled Banner, and an increase of patriotism during this. The domestic impact of American imperialism also had racial implications. So by the end of the 19th century, the Black South had started to appear as a kind of internal colony in which whites were benefiting from the exploitation and subjugation of blacks. And we can see this very starkly in the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So in 1896, a landmark Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, gave its approval to certain state laws in the South requiring separate facilities for blacks and whites. The case arose in Louisiana, where the legislature had required railroad companies to maintain a separate car section for black passengers. A citizens' committee of black residents in New Orleans came together to protest and challenge this law, and to create a test case in which Homer Plessy, featured here to the left, a light-skinned African American, refused a conductor's order to move to the colored-only part of his railway car, and Homer Plessy was summarily arrested and held for trial. The trial reached all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896, and before the Supreme Court, the Citizens Committee argued, citizenship is national and knows no color. And racial segregation violated, they argued, the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection before the law. Okay, so these, again, are the Reconstruction Amendments being challenged continuously over time. The Supreme Court decided, however, and upheld Louisiana's law, arguing that segregated facilities did not discriminate as long as they were separate but equal, establishing this doctrine in American legal system of separate but equal, okay, which enabled various facilities throughout the South to implement segregation. So you see proliferation of segregated spaces throughout America during this time based on this separate but equal doctrine. Okay, and so some scholars consider the Plessy versus Ferguson decision as the legal bedrock. Segregation is the legal bedrock of Jim Crow. So we've seen voting laws and Jim Crow cultural manifestations, but Plessy versus Ferguson really gives Jim Crow its legal teeth up until the 1950s. Segregation affected other groups as well as blacks. In some parts of Mississippi, where Chinese laborers had been brought to work in the fields after the Civil War, 3 separate school systems, white, black, and Chinese, were established, for example. In Texas and California, another example, although Mexicans were legally considered white, they found themselves barred from many restaurants and places of entertainment and other public facilities. So Plessy versus Ferguson corresponded to this spatial segregation of along racial lines throughout America, not explicitly against blacks, but rather against many non-white ethnic groups as well. So the story of Won Kim Ark is a Chinese citizen who was born in California, Won Kim Ark, and travels back to China to visit his family amid a wave of anti-Chinese protest in America, which produced acts like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which explicitly barred Asian and Chinese immigration to the United States for a period of time. So Won Kim Ark travels back to China, visits his family, and because he's born in the United States, he believes he has, he's granted citizenship, and so doesn't fear any persecution coming back according to the Chinese Exclusion Act. However, when he comes back to San Francisco, he's denied entry into the United States, and he gets a lawyer and argues his position, declaring that he's born in the United States and therefore is subject to all the rights and protections of the United States citizens. This court case reaches the United States Supreme Court, which considered the status of Chinese Asian Americans in 1898. With the decision, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment awarded citizenship to the children of Chinese immigrants who were born on American soil. So at this time, we see provisions of the 14th Amendment upheld by the Won Kim Ark, and this establishes this doctrine of birthright citizenship. Up until this time, this concept of being born in the United States is not solidified as a passage to citizenship, but Won Kim Ark thereafter establishes this doctrine. So in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, we also have the Johnson Quota Act, which is similarly corresponds to these imperialistic motives. Keep in mind the open door policy, the free movement of goods, money, but not people. The Johnson Quota Act really reifies this concept in the sense that it's passed on the wave of anti-immigration legislation. So the Johnson Quota Act is this landmark decision, this landmark piece of legislation that carries through the next 50 years. So the Johnson Quota Act is establishing a quota system whereby the United States immigration policy only admits a certain quota of people from non-white territories. So, for example, there's going to be a certain number of people from China, like Wang Kim Ark's family, or a certain number of people from the Caribbean, like we'll see Marcus Garvey coming over from the Caribbean. However, the racial implications here are that there are higher quotas for white Anglo-Saxon countries and lower quotas for non-white countries, establishing immediately a racial bias in American immigration policy that takes more than half a century to overturn. So the Johnson Quota Act is later overturned by another Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, in a package of legislation called the Great Society. So we'll be covering that later in the semester. So nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, America had solidified its imperialistic empire, and so by the second election of William McKinley, we see the promise of a new American empire and the benefits of a new American empire. So in this political campaign advertisement, we see some of these promises. So we see Gone Democratic, 1896, Gone Democratic, a run on the bank, Spanish rule in Cuba. These are all bad things in 1896. These are all bad things in 1896. And the promise is in that in 1900, the country will be fully republican, and America will rule in Cuba. So some key terms to keep in mind are Fordlandia. You will have to understand some of the motivations and implications of imperialism. Who are the Rough Riders? What does the Chinese Exclusion Act do? Similarly, what does the Johnson Quota Act of 1924 do? We'll touch on lynching a little bit later, but at this time we see a explosion of lynching we're going to see that in the progressive era, in the way in which activists are going to be protesting this. Plessy versus Ferguson. What is the importance of Plessy versus Ferguson? Similarly, the importance of the United States versus Wang Kim Ark.